Alright, so welcome to the second day of our CoEDL celebratory end of centre event, or nearly end of centre event. And today's day will be much better. Sounds like feedback. Well, I'll keep going and see. Alright, so today's day is a program put together by the original team of chief investigators to turn to some of the questions we posed at the beginning, some of the ways we proposed to go about it. And rather than just following our familiar divisions into programs or threads and so on, we thought we would hash and dice the subject matter in another way and focus on four, I suppose, organisational themes that we think made our research run. So the first one is longevity. That's been jostling with an alternative name of longitudinality for this course, because one of the great things about Centre of Excellence is we get to run it for 7 years, which, as I said yesterday, turned into 8.25 years. It means you can do things that you can't do in the framework of a 3 or 4 year grant. So we wanted to highlight some of those. And then in the second quarter, that is after the morning coffee break, we want to showcase interdisciplinarity. Because again, as I said yesterday, we wanted the Centre to bring together people from different backgrounds. So we'll have some sessions in there. Then after lunch, we'll turn to the transformative role of technologies in the research we've done. And in the final session, because science should always be more than what you thought you were going to do at the start, it's no good if you just have a predefined problem and solve it. We always want new things to come up. We thought we would have a special surprise pack, which are things we didn't expect at the beginning or didn't even know we would look into, and popped up. So that's the order of the day, and we're very lucky to have Liz Fisher here from the ARC Centre of Excellence program. Welcome, Liz, it's great to have you here. And Liz will also be addressing us just before lunch. One other organisational thing, during lunchtime, we want to make a number of photographs in different configurations of people. So one is of the chief investigators, one is chief investigators plus the advisory board, one is of the professional team. So please just, if you're in any of those categories, please make your way to the foyer right at the beginning of lunch so we can snap you all. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rachel, who is moderating the first session of this morning. It's appropriate that Rachel be in longevity.
Oh, thank you. I'm not quite sure how to take that, but anyway, I'll take it as a positive.
You have stamina.
Oh, great. Thank you. All right. Well, hello everyone. I'm Rachel Nordlinger, one of the CIs of CoEDL, and we now have a session on longevity, and our first speaker is Thieberger, who is a chief investigator as well from the University of Melbourne, and he's going to talk to us about the PARADISEC archive and longevity.
So yeah, I'll talk to you about PARADISEC. I expect everybody knows about PARADISEC, but the point of an archive like PARADISEC is that we want to capture all of the primary recordings made by researchers in the project, and of course PARADISEC has also got lots of connections outside of CoEDL. But the kinds of things I'm talking about are, the audio, the video, transcripts, notes, photographs, all the primary materials that are being created, and that all have potentially immense cultural significance beyond the research significance that we create them for in the first place. Of course, all the secondary outputs, publications and so on are well catered for, and so we don't need to really worry about that. That's dealt with by our universities. But the fact is that in Australia, nobody is curating primary research data. We have an Australian Research Data Commons doesn't do it. Previously we had the Australian National Data Service, it didn't do it. So PARADISEC has been doing this now for 20 years, but we wait for the day when the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Service will also curate primary data for us as well as for STEM. CoEDL has taken longevity seriously. We saw the fabric yesterday. Nick outlined the fabric of CoEDL in our logo, and archiving has always been a thread within that logo. So we do this archiving of primary records for a number of reasons. It's good research practice. It's good research practice to cite primary data back to a source so you can support theoretical claims. And in linguistics we know that people take example sentences that then go feral, go all over the place with their typos, and people keep citing the example sentence but never go back to the primary data. Archiving data means that you can build on existing research rather than doing it all over again. And of course, when you're doing fieldwork in remote locations, you may be the only person who ever makes records in that place, and so they become all the more valuable for that. Archiving is important just so that you don't lose your own records. And we've had lots of examples of people who come back to the collection to get their own materials out of the archive because their computers crashed, their hard disks gone, or whatever. It's a very good way of keeping track of your own materials over time, and often the only time people organise their collections is when they deposit them in PARADISEC, otherwise they're just sitting there full of good intentions. And of course you can verify claims made, and that's a key research criterion, but there are also of course ethical reasons for curating and archiving data, is that this material is, they're records of cultural and human value, not just to us, but to the people we work with. We can provide access to the broader community, so it's not just a research-facing repository, this is a public-facing repository that can serve both research needs and the broader public. And this is really important so that the people recorded and their descendants can get access to the records. There's been a heavy investment in creating this data. If you go to the field, you cost a lot of money, your airfares cost a lot of money, your equipment costs a lot of money, and if you distilled all that down to 1 hour of your recordings, they're probably worth $10,000 each. We've never really done that costing, but there is a heavy investment, and that investment is lost in so many projects that end, and then the data's all lost. So you get your publications, you get your journal articles and books, but the primary records are not cared for most disciplines, and this is something that CoEDL has really recognised and invested in. We have Julia Miller here in Canberra and Wolfgang Barth, both working on collections of materials. And we have the PARADISEC team in Sydney, led by Matt Harris, and also in Melbourne with Sam King and Michael LaRosa, among others. There is, of course, for the politician, the fact that taxpayers have invested in this, and this is a way of taxpayers getting access to materials that they've already paid for. So PARADISEC is an archive that's been operating for 20 years. It's always been a collaboration between University of Sydney, ANU and University of Melbourne. At the moment there are actually 1,335 languages, I just checked, we've just added another one. And when we say languages represented, obviously that's bits and pieces, so there are some recordings, some manuscripts in each of these 1,334 languages. And you can see the statistics there, but getting on for 200 terabytes, it's a massive collection to look after. 15,500 hours of audio and increasing amounts of video, obviously now as people are doing more and more fieldwork with video. But all of this needs to be maintained, and it's large amounts of data and it needs to be looked after properly. I hear you say, don't our universities provide us with data storage? Isn't that enough? Well, no, data storage is not enough. Data storage is just storage. It doesn't give you deposit conditions, for example. How can you use this material? How can other people access it? If it's on storage on OneDrive in your university, it's not accessible by other people. This is inward-facing storage. It's not facing the general public. and typically you are the only person that can access that material. So curated material in PARADISEC has access conditions which are supplied by the depositor, and they say how the material can be used. You need to have licenses on this material, otherwise you don't know what you can do with it. We have an upload routine that checks the file names and types to ensure consistency, and we can do this with minimal staff time. We've built a system that runs, we talk about it being drought and flooding rain. So when we have funding and we're in flooding rain, the project runs well, but we've built it so that when the droughts are on and we don't have funding, the archive continues to run nevertheless, and we can continue to ingest new material and people can continue to download and access that material. We run checks over the collection periodically, every day. We run checksum checks to make sure that the collection has integrity. We do backups and disaster recovery, so we check every now and then that our backups actually work. We go and retrieve items from the backup to see that it's still the thing that we think it is. And the catalogue of all of this is publicly available. So all of this is not what our universities are providing. Our universities are just providing storage. And we need to put pressure on our universities, we need to put pressure on the national research organisations to provide proper data curation and not just storage. One of the things that linguists have that's also a great advantage is that we have the Open Language Archives community, which is a service that looks at all the language archives in the world, and it has currently 60 archives in its remit, and it harvests the metadata from these archives every day, and then it creates a viewer for all of the information that's in all of the archives, which is quite a wonderful thing, that you can then see what language material there is in all of the language archives in the world, and you can do visualizations like this, which we've done thanks to CoEDL. This is a service that's in this Language Archive Services. It takes the OLAC metadata, it presents you then with a view of, in this case, Vanuatu, and you can see from the icons how much material there is in language archives for Vanuatu. And then you can visualise it in other ways like this. So here we have the big green icons show you languages with lots of material, the little white icons show you languages with not very much material in language archives. And this kind of visualisation is possible because the archives participate in providing the metadata to OLAC. OLAC provides this aggregated view of it every day, and you can harvest that material and then create these kinds of visualisations. And if you wanted to, then you could go off and click down to the level of the object in the collection. So we saw, yesterday Nick showed us a graph of the number of languages represented in PARADISEC over time, and the yellow box there represents the period of CoEDL, so pre-CoEDL, post-CoEDL, and yeah, around 1330 for language, 35 languages today, and then the number of files also. You can see that CoEDL has added significantly to the number of files, and as we near the end of CoEDL, that end of the graph probably goes almost vertical, because everybody's putting in their materials at the end of CoEDL, and I know Julia and the rest of the team are working very hard to get all that material into the collection. PARADISEC doesn't just work with researchers now. We do a lot of work on legacy collections, and we've done a lot of work on outreach, which we talked a bit about yesterday, into the Pacific. So here you can see a number of different collections. In the top left is Helen Vorm's tapes, which are just here at the ANU, but they've been sitting in the ANU as tapes forever, and now we've just started working on them. Just across from that is Ambong Thompson, who's the audio engineer at the Vanuatu Cultural Centre, and we've been digitising tapes with them now over a number of years and returning them, so you can see the return of materials there. One of the other collections here is in the Basel Museum in Switzerland, and that's Father John Scruggan's recordings from Madang. Again, just sitting there as tapes in this museum and not digitised. But through long negotiations, those tapes were sent to the MPI in Nijmegen, digitised, and now they're put into the PARADISEC collection. But, you know, so even in major institutions like the Basel Museum, these tapes are just sitting there and they're not being looked after, they're not getting back to the source communities. And up here, we have Ton Haoki, who's was the director of the Solomon Islands National Museum. So these relationships are important, but PARADISEC is the base from which we can go out and do this work and then make this available to people, either in closed access if they want, or making it available in various ways. We've worked with the National Library. Again, this is thanks to CoEDL. We've been able to work on a number of microfilms that were sitting in the National Library and fairly inaccessible. Microfilms are quite inaccessible anyway because you have to have a microfilm reader and it's quite a business getting through them. So we digitised all of these microfilms, and these are dictionaries and manuscripts in very specific languages. And now they're in the PARADISEC collection. And similarly, the Pacific Manuscripts Bureau, which is a service here at ANU, also have many microfilms. But Pambu is a subscription service, so not only are microfilms difficult to get to, but you have to be a subscriber to Pambu to be able to get access to the microfilm as well. So we negotiated with them to digitise all of these microfilms and to get permission from the subscribers to put them into open access in PARADISEC. Again, many dictionaries and manuscripts from the Pacific. So a major benefit of creating primary records is that they can be reused, they can be cited, and form the basis for new research. So here's an example of tapes in Jehu, a language of New Caledonia, and Leonard Gillet Sam had these tapes. I was there running a workshop and he said, oh, I've got some tapes at home. So he gave me these reel-to-reel tapes, which were in his house. He had no reel-to-reel player. I took them back to Australia. They needed to be cleaned. They were mouldy because tapes in the tropics go mouldy, can go mouldy. And then we digitised and put them into the collection. He said what conditions could be applied to make them open access. But then 12 years later, there was a Jehu speaker in Melbourne who I encountered, and she started transcribing these recordings. So then we have the transcripts of the recordings. But that could only be done because the recordings were in a collection. So then you can build on that, and then somebody else will maybe do some work on some aspect of that, maybe the content, or maybe looking at prosody in the recordings or whatever. But all of this is possible only because the material is digitised appropriately, has persistent location and persistent identification. Just before you came by, I started, and before this session, you might have seen the soundscape that was up there. This was a way of visualising material in the collection. Audio collections are very difficult to visualise. You can't go and listen to 15,000 hours of audio very easily. So we took 20-second snippets out of the collection and put them into that soundscape. And another way of doing this that you may have seen yesterday is Gloss Opticon, which was a 3D virtual reality flyover of the countries that we have in the collection, and each of these shards coming up out of the ground represents language. The blue shards have some audio, and as you fly through them, you're flying through a forest of languages, and the VR gives you this wonderful effect of hearing the languages come towards you and recede behind you, and you have this whole forest of languages, but you can select one and listen to just that one. So 20-second snippets of items from the collection. Only possible because the collection has the metadata, it has the persistent identification, it has all this stuff. So once you've got the material, you can do all these really interesting things with it. The other thing that we want, actually I could show you a video of it. So if you're flying through the landscape, the audio's not working, but as you fly through, you can select languages. It tells you something about the languages. It tells you how many speakers there are and so on. We're flying over Melanesia at the moment. Into Indonesia. Okay. One of the issues for us then is how to get this material back to the source communities. Obviously, small villages in remote areas, we can't get out to those places, but we can get to regional cultural centres. And we have done this. So we started by working with a lot of recordings that were here at the ANU, so recordings made by Stephen Vorm, Bert Verhoeven, Arthur Capel, Tom Dutton, all of these people, and the tapes were just sitting here and nobody was looking after them. So the group of people, including a number of people in this room who were CIs on the original project, got funding to do that initial work. And now we were able to take those tapes that came from Papua New Guinea to the Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies. But a problem with putting a whole bunch of files on a hard disk like this is that they're sort of meaningless. Right? You just get a whole bunch of files, and without a catalogue, it's very difficult to know what's on them. Sending a hard disk is fine, and it's a form of repatriation, but without a catalogue, it's very difficult for those people in those receiving institutions to know what to do with them. So within PARADISEC, we can select items. So, for instance, if we go to Papua New Guinea, we can select all the items that come from Papua New Guinea, that come from a number of different collections, and we can put them into a location. And the way we've constructed our catalogue is that it writes a little file into the items in the collection. There's a little XML file, and that is a catalogue of just those items. So if we pull that item, that folder, that directory out and put it onto a hard disk, it's self-describing because our catalogue writes that item file in there. And then what we've done is written some software which captures all of those files and writes a simple HTML catalogue of just that collection. So then you get a catalogue of a sub-collection that's appropriate to the people who are going to receive it, and you can put that onto a hard disk. But the other exciting thing is using something like a Raspberry Pi, which is a Wi-Fi transmitter, low-powered computer, and that then allows people within a radius, 30 metres or something like that, to access this material on their phones. And this is the way that most people, especially in small remote areas, are accessing information is through mobile phones. They're not using computers, so a hard disk is not as appropriate as a local Wi-Fi network. So we've put instructions again on that same Language Archive Services site about this software and how you can use it if you want to. And we've tested this out. So here's an example. We've tested it in Western Desert, Inga, and others have tried it out and it's worked in Western Desert. This is trying it in Iroquois village in Vanuatu, and we've done it at a workshop that we ran in Honiara, where people were able to access materials within the workshop setting. You set up the Raspberry Pi and they can access the material. Here they are accessing material in their language on their mobile phones, and they can download the files to their own mobile phones. So we've done a lot of training sessions, and we talked about some of them yesterday. In 2016, we ran a Tools and Methods Summit in Melbourne, and CoEDL funded this summit that brought leaders in the field to Melbourne and to sort of set an agenda for what we can do over the lifetime of CoEDL. And one of the things that came out of that was the development. There was a recognition that we needed better ways of creating collections so that we can archive them. So if you're creating collections on your laptop in the field, how can you describe that in a way that can go straight into the archive without you having to do a lot of extra work? And we came up with the idea of this tool, which we now call LaMeta, which was based on a Summer Institute of Linguistics tool called Seymour. This is a joint project with the Endangered Language Archive and the University of Hawaii, and was funded by the National Science Foundation and CoEDL and ELDP. And it's now out there and you can use it. It means that you can drop files into a directory on your laptop and then describe them. So it presents you with that file. If it's an image, you can look at the image and then you can put in standard metadata terms to describe it. And then LaMeta bundles that into the format necessary for the various archives. So there's one output for PARADISEC, there's one output for the Endangered Language Archive in Berlin. So PARADISEC has still got a long queue, and it's not going to end at the end of CoEDL. PARADISEC will continue in some form or another, and with some funding or another. We still have lots of materials and some new collections coming in. We've been talking to the Yap archives in Micronesia, who have a lot of tapes and nobody's helping them. We just got some tapes from Wallace in Polynesia, and we have ongoing work with the Van Ocean Cultural Centre. We just got some more tapes from Bert Verhoeven, who was one of the early depositors, and now we got some more of his tapes, and we've been working with them. We have a new ARC leaf, thank you ARC, Leaf project over these next 2 years, which will help us update our catalogue system. Writing research object code, we can talk about that if you want, but we'll be doing more return of materials. We have funding to buy 30 Raspberry Pis, so we're going to be investing in that. And we're also working with ELPIS, again an output of CoEDL, to experiment on ways of running ELPIS, which is recognition of audio and rendering it as text, so doing textual transcriptions of unknown languages. We're testing that on languages. Ultimately, we'd like to unleash it on the whole PARADISEC collection and see what we get, but we'll start small. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. There's probably time for one question before we move on, or a couple of short questions, if anyone has one for Nick. Yeah.
The name Elpis, is that deliberately a pun with the Greek word for hope?
That's good.
Yes.
Okay. That was a question for Ben. Are there any questions? Any questions for Nick? Oh, yes, over here.
I was wondering if the OLEC quiz, which I sort of browsed, was great fun, only shows items that are freely available?
No, it shows anything that's in the catalogue, so you'd have to figure out if you found something that wasn't. Yeah, but we could do that. That there is a part of our Leaf funding is to update all the OLEC materials, so we could, take it. That's a good suggestion that we could mark it in some ways.
Yeah. I also was flipping around and wanted to be like, oh, I only want to see PARADISEC. Probably no one else can, but I did.
All right. Well, thank you, Nick. A fabulous example of the importance of long-term thinking and funding, and also the benefits. So, thank you very much. Did we thank Nick? Next up, I'm just waiting to see if the slide comes, but the next presentation is from another chief investigator, Evan Kidd, who was at the ANU and then is currently at the Max Planck Institute, Nijmegen, and will soon be back at the ANU. But he is not here today, but he's delivering his presentation by video, pre-recorded video, and he's talking about his project which looked at child acquisition, the Canberra Longitudinal Child Language Project. So over to him.
Hi everyone, I'm Evan, for those of you who don't know me, and for the next 20 odd minutes or so I'm going to tell you about the major project that we conducted in the ANU Language Lab for the CoE, which was the Canberra Longitudinal Child Language Project. So I'll spend the next 25 minutes or so telling you about CLCL, as we've abbreviated it. But up front, I need to acknowledge the input of many amazing people who've contributed to this project. You'll no doubt recognise most, if not all, of these people in these photos, and we'll hear their names throughout the presentation. But I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge and thank Anne Cutler in particular for her input. Anne was incredibly supportive of the project from its inception and brought to it her sharp intellect and unbridled enthusiasm for research. CoEDL enabled me, as a youngish upstart, to work with Anne, and for that I'll be eternally grateful. I also have to mention the amazing folks who have worked in the ANU Language Lab over the last 7 years, most of whom are in the bigger photo there. I seem to have stumbled across a group of amazingly committed and enthusiastic individuals who, as a group, weathered a mostly absent supervisor and a global pandemic to boot. All of this without missing a beat. They're the true heroes of this story, alongside all of the families and the children who took part. And now to CLCL. The aim of the study was to chart individual differences in children's language processing skills and link these to children's linguistic knowledge and to their input. So beginning at 9 months of age, we charted the development of English acquiring children's language using an array of experimental and observational methods until the children were 5 years of age, when they were just about to start or had just started school, depending on which part of the year they were born in. And initially we had 130 children or thereabouts, and by the end of the study, after a bit of dropout, we had just over 100. So this period of development from 9 months to 5 years is a period of rapid language growth in children, as many of you who've seen development firsthand will know. At 9 months of age, children basically say nothing, and they might know a few words and maybe a phrase or two. And by 5 years, they're quite competent speakers. They don't know everything, but they've laid the foundations for what they'll need to know in order to do other language-related tasks like literacy. So we had a focus on individual differences, which is true of any longitudinal study, really. And it's important to understand the nature of individual differences in language acquisition for both theoretical and practical reasons. The theoretical reason is that if we can identify the source of individual differences, we can move one step closer to understanding the determinants and mechanisms driving acquisition. And this brings us closer to a more comprehensive understanding of the language acquisition process. The practical reason is that individual differences have real-world consequences. Language proficiency is a key predictor of many important life outcomes, such as academic achievement and socio-emotional well-being. So, the earlier we can identify the causes of stable individual differences, the earlier we can find targets for intervention. So here's a broad timeline of what we studied across the project. So beginning at 9 months, when children don't really say anything and are laying the foundations for later language production, we looked at how children, or whether or not there are individual differences in children's ability to identify words from running speech, and this is what's called speech segmentation. Then in their second year, moving right up to the age of about 3, we looked at their vocabulary acquisition or their lexical acquisition and their processing of words. Beginning at the age of 2, leading right up to 4.5, we looked at the children's syntactic acquisition and their syntactic processing. Then finally, at the end, we looked at a lot of outcome measures at the 60-month point. So we looked at a broad array of their language proficiency, but we also looked at things that are broader than language. So we also looked at a bunch of socio-emotional indicators, which are good markers of school readiness in children. So I'm going to present some data that looks at all of these developments and how they relate to acquisition at other levels of language as well throughout the talk. I must say that I have to be necessarily brief, and I'm only going to give you the Cliff's Notes of a lot of what we've done. We've got lots and lots of data, and we've got a lot of work to do in the years to come. I think I'll be working on this until I retire. So let's dive first into speech segmentation. Speech segmentation is one of the first tasks that children have to master in order to begin constructing a language. When we see words written down, we have spaces in between them, and this facilitates our word recognition. But this doesn't happen in spoken language. There are no pauses in between words to facilitate our word recognition. So when children are learning a spoken language, they have to find the word boundaries in order to isolate words and then commit them to memory to start building a lexicon. So we studied speech segmentation in a paradigm that Anne Cutler and her colleagues, including Caroline Jung from Utrecht University, had developed using a methodological technique called electroencephalography. Now, I'll just briefly describe the paradigm for you. So what happens is children hear a sentence, such as the eagle is in the nest, and then 300 milliseconds later, they hear an isolated word in a number of conditions. So in the direct familiar condition, they hear a word that was contained in the previous sentence. So they hear the eagle is in the nest, and then they hear eagle. In an unfamiliar condition, they hear a word that wasn't in the sentence and wasn't yet heard in the context of the experiment, such as pencil, and this is the unfamiliar condition. In an indirect familiar condition, they hear a word that wasn't in the sentence, but they had heard previously in the experiment about, on average, 10 sentences back, which was maybe a minute prior to hearing it again. So what we do in this task is we just simply play the sentences to the children and the isolated words, and we record their reactions, their implicit reactions to the words given the sentences using EEG, or electroencephalography. Now, EEG is when you, as you can see in this picture here, you record the electrical activity from the scalp of the child using electrodes that are placed on the child's head. Now, what we're interested in here is A, can they recognize that they've just heard a word in the direct familiar condition? Can they recognize words that they've heard a minute or so previously, such that they had a memory representation for them? And do these two conditions, the direct familiar and the indirect familiar condition, differ from this unfamiliar condition where they've never heard that word before? So are they distinguishing between these conditions implicitly as measured by EEG? So now on to the results. What's really interesting about these data is that we find meaningful individual differences amongst the children even at 9 months in their segmentation. So the children showed different responses and qualitatively different responses to the different experimental conditions. So in a mature group, or a group of children who showed a mature segmentation response, we find that they're distinguishing between all of these conditions that we had, and in a way that indicates that they're recognizing the words as words in the language. So I'll quickly run you through how to interpret this graph. So what the figure here shows is the electrical activity is recorded from a group of electrodes over the left frontal regions of the scalp, which is around the language areas. The graph plots this electrical activity over time, which is on the x-axis, beginning 200 milliseconds before the onset of the isolated word. And then the y-axis is the amplitude of the voltage of the electrical activity. EEG, or ERPs, I should say, graph the voltage upside down. So what we have here is a negative deflection, negative going waveform for the direct familiar condition. And this is similar to what we'd see in older children who are who have the same response to words that we know that they know. Interestingly, in this group of mature users, they're distinguishing between the direct familiar and the unfamiliar condition, and the indirect familiar condition, so this memory condition, is in between, but they're still distinguishing between the indirect familiar and the unfamiliar condition, suggesting that not only do they recognize words that they've just heard, they have a memory for words they've heard a minute prior or 10 sentences prior. Now, we had another group of children who showed the exact polar opposite response. They show a positive going waveform to the direct familiar in comparison to the unfamiliar condition, and they don't distinguish, however, between the unfamiliar and the indirect familiar condition. Now, what we think this is an immature response where children aren't recognizing the words, but they're recognizing prominent features of words, such as stressed syllables. And interestingly, we had a group of children who were somewhat in between, and some extra digging into the data showed that these children were moving from this positivity to this more mature negative response. Interestingly, what we also found is that the size of this negativity predicted the children's language comprehension or vocabulary comprehension 6 months later when they were at 15 months. So that's what this graph here plots as the association between the size of the negativity and the size of the children's comprehension lexicon 6 months later. This association still held after we controlled for things like parental socioeconomic status, the child's gender, and their vocabulary size at 9 months, which was pretty small anyway. So what we find here is even at 9 months, when children aren't really saying a lot, we can, using the right kinds of methods, we can find meaningful individual differences amongst the children. Okay, so that was segmentation, and now let's look at lexical acquisition and lexical processing and concentrate on one aspect that we've been really digging into into in this project, in other projects, which is conversational turn taking and vocabulary development. So why conversational turn taking? Amongst the myriad of things that probably do and will predict vocabulary acquisition. Well, the first reason is that interaction forms the basis of early language development. Language development appears to be socially gated, such that children learn the best when they are engaged in meaningful interactions with others or observing meaningful interactions between other parties. In conversation, adults can scaffold interaction to draw children in and maintain their attention. And within these interactions, language can be calibrated to the child's level and interest. But children and caregivers vary in the degree to which they engage in conversational interaction. So we assumed then that the degree to which parents and children engage, or caregivers engage in conversational interaction, may well be a significant predictor of lexical acquisition. And in fact, this is what we found. In the CLCL cohort, we tracked the reciprocal relationship between conversational turn-taking and vocabulary development from when the children were 9 months at the beginning of the study until when they were 24 months of age. And we did so using a special type of language environment recorder. So as you can see in the picture with the woman and the child, the woman is putting a recorder into the overalls of the child. And what this is a day-long recording device that records about up to 16 hours of the child's language environment. After you've made the recording, you can plug the recorder into a special program, and what the program does is compute a bunch of indices of the children's language environment, including how many words they hear in their environment, but also how many conversational turns they make with other conversational partners. So we use this to record the children's language environment, including their conversational turns, but you'll also use the MacArthur-Bates CDI, which is a parental report checklist, where parents mark the words that the children say. So what we found is this is a reciprocal relationship between conversational turn-taking and vocabulary development. What we see here in this graph is the number of conversational turns for each child across time. As you can see, it's increasing, but there's also a large amount of individual variability amongst the children, with the dots indicating single children. What you can see also is a sharp increase in children's vocabulary that begins at about, say, 15 months after a slow start. So what we did is, in this paper that we published in Child Development, is we looked at whether or not conversational turns predict vocabulary, and reciprocally and longitudinally, vocabulary predicts conversational turns. And this is exactly what we found. So what we have evidence for in the CLCL cohort is a kind of rich gets richer effect, where if you're got more vocabulary, you're more likely to engage others in conversation, and engaging others in more conversation results in greater growth in vocabulary. So those data suggest that conversational turn-taking is important for children's early language development. And in a separate longitudinal study that's on the basis of Sarah Quinn's and Noelle Craig's PhDs, we've been digging deeper into this effect. In particular, Noelle has been interested in what's going on within conversational turns, focusing on one prominent aspect of children's early experiences, which is play. So in particular, Noelle's been looking at whether or not there's symbolic content within play and how this affects conversational turn-taking compared to when there isn't symbolic content in conversation. Using John Heritage's Territories of Knowledge framework, Noelle coded whether or not children were knowledgeable speakers or listeners in instances of interactions that contain symbolic content, which in the case of children is symbolic play, so pretending to have a tea party, for instance, versus when there wasn't symbolic content. Say, for instance, when when parents were instructing their children to perform a particular task, such as eating. And what she found is something that's quite interesting. So she found that within symbolic play, or within instances of symbolic play, children have a greater understanding of the conversational content than when there isn't symbolic content in an interaction. So what this graph here shows is that infants are more knowledgeable speakers when there's instances of symbolic play, and they're more knowledgeable listeners in instances of symbolic play, suggesting that when there's symbolic play, there's something that's important about that that's fostering interaction. And what we think that is the ambiguity associated with the symbolic play scenario. That means that children and parents have to negotiate meaning. Negotiating meaning involves greater conversational turns, which can then lead to greater language learning opportunities. Now, in work that we're currently writing up, Noelle has looked at the conversational turns using discursus in this separate cohort from CLCL. So using discursus, which was developed, of course, by Dan Angus and Janet Wiles at UQ, discursus is a program that looks at conversational overlap or content overlap between speakers in a conversation. So if I introduce a topic, does my conversational partner also pick up on that topic? And therefore, do we have a greater accommodation with each other, or greater common ground? And what we found is that in instances of symbolic play, there is greater conversational overlap or greater content overlap than in instances where there isn't symbolic content or in what we call functional play. So here's a discursus map that shows the degree to which there is content overlap between speakers or between one dyad in this case, in symbolic play. And as you can see here, there's lots of overlap, which is indicated by the little squares underneath the line, which represents the time in the conversational interaction. And if we can compare this to functional play, we see much less conversational overlap. So overall, what we think is going on here is that when you have a challenging context where there's some kind of ambiguity, as in that you have to fill in, like in an instance of symbolic play, then what this is doing is fostering interaction, and this interaction is therefore leading to greater language learning opportunities and gains in young children. And this is all consistent with Jerome Bruner's old arguments that the development of language involves two people negotiating, in particular negotiating meaning. So that's some of the work we've been doing on lexical acquisition, and there's a whole bunch of stuff on lexical processing that unfortunately I'm not going to talk about. But let's now move on to syntactic acquisition and processing. So we've done many studies of syntactic acquisition in CLCL, but what I'll tell you about here is just one fairly large data set looking at mechanisms of syntactic development using the technique syntactic priming. So what happens in priming is that children see a picture of a transitive event in this case, and they hear a description of that event. Here, using the passive, the experimenter might say, "The bird was kissed by the monkey." Then, simply, a child is presented with another picture, such as this one here, and in a couple of conditions, and I'll show you both of them, and they're asked to describe it. And if they use a passive, they are primed. So in this condition, which is called a verb overlap, we have the same action but different participants. So if the children say the cow was kissed by the duck, they're said to have been primed. Now, in another condition where there's no content overlap or content word overlap, if the child produces a sentence such as "the sheep was poked by the dog" using a passive, then they're said to have been primed. But this is an instance of abstract priming because there's no content overlap in terms of the nouns and the verbs in the sentence. So we looked at the development of the passive structure using the priming method when the children were 3 years, and we followed them for the next 18 months when they were 4.5, and we tested them every 6 months. So we have 4 time points in a longitudinal design. Now, the data are a bit complex, so I'll walk you through them. So what the graph here shows is the size of the priming effect for the different conditions, both the abstract priming effect and the lexical boost across time. And we have plotted it for when one verb, push, was included and excluded from the data set because push tended to behave a bit weirdly in the early time points. That need not concern us here. So what we find actually is the abstract priming effect emerges early. So what you see here is that at 3 or 36 months, the orange line is above the green line. So what that suggests is that, at least in some of the children, they have abstract knowledge of the passive at the age of 3, which is pretty early. However, it does vary, and this variation is predicted by their language proficiency 6 months earlier. So what we have is significant individual differences here. What we also find is that there's divergent developmental patterns going on across the conditions, whereas we find a decrease in the abstract priming effect, we have an increase in the lexical boost effect. And what we think is going on here is that there's two different mechanisms at play in these two conditions. The first is that abstract priming is driven by error-based learning, which I'll come to in the next slide. And the second is that the lexical boost effect is increasing because it's related to increases in the children's explicit memory for the prime sentence. So what the explanation is for this is that, for instance, if a child hears a prime that involves the verb kiss, and they have to describe a target picture that involves the action kiss, that action cues their memory, their explicit memory, for the targets, or the prime structure that they had just heard previously. And because their explicit memory increases across development, you find this increase in the lexical boost across development. Okay, so how can error-based learning be an explanation for priming and a mechanism for language development? So just say that a child sees the prime picture here, and then they get a semantic representation of this event. The event is kiss, and the monkey is the agent, and the bird is the patient. Now, they probably have an expectation that this would be described using an active structure. So this is something they predict. Now, if this is borne out, if the experimenter uses an active prime, then really the child isn't so surprised and there's nothing to see here. On the other hand, if the picture is described using a passive prime, this is not predicted because passives are low in frequency and then typically unheard. So this is not predicted because an active would be predicted, and the child is surprised. So as a result of this surprisal, the argument from error-based learning is that children learn from this incorrect prediction that they've made, such that there's representational updating, in particular, that they update their prediction of the probability of a passive being used given a transitive event, such that it's higher relative to actives than it was before they heard a passive. And this therefore leads to subsequent productions of passive in the target trials. Now, why does the size of the effect decrease as children get older? Well, this should be predicted by an error-based learning account because as children hear more and more passives across time, they get less and less surprised by their use, and therefore the error prediction is lower, and therefore there's lower amounts of priming. So this brings me to the end of my talk. We've only really scratched the surface of what we've found and what we will find out with this data set. I haven't talked about outcomes. We have some outcome data that we're currently working on, and we're very excited by the results, but I'll leave those for another time when I've got more time. What I want to leave you with is some reflections on what we've learned from conducting this study. And the first is that gold standard longitudinal data are essential to studying developmental processes, and really it's only through the COE program that we've been able to do this to the extent that we have done in this project. The CLCL dataset revealed the pervasiveness of individual differences in language acquisition and their potential to reveal important drivers and mechanisms of development. And I'm happy to say I think we're really at the forefront of this, and we have seen an upsurge in the study of individual differences in both language acquisition and language processing since we started this project. They also reveal the complex interconnected nature of language across multiple levels of description. We see segmentation related to vocabulary, vocabulary related to syntax, and so on and so forth. They also revealed that developmental effects and theories based on cross-sectional comparisons often don't hold up against our data. What we're really finding is that longitudinal data are very essential if we're going to say something meaningful about development. So finally, I'd like to acknowledge some important institutions and people without whom none of this would be possible. The first is the ARC, who funded CoEDL. The second is the Max Planck Gesellschaft, in particular the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics, who also contributed time and money to this project. Their support's also gratefully acknowledged. Finally, as I said, the real heroes of this story are the families that participated. We really had no idea when we started this if it was going to be possible that people would invite us into their lives for 4 years. And it was truly astonishing that it worked as well as it did. So we thank all the families that participated. It was truly a pleasure to work with them and to see the children grow up as well. So with that, I wish you a very enjoyable final CoEDL event, and I hope to see you all very soon.
All right, we'll have to save any questions for December when Evan gets back to Australia. So fortunately, we don't have time for them anyway, so we'll move on. So another idea, I suppose, program that we had in mind at the beginning of CoEDL was to take advantage of the longevity of CoEDL to really try to change the way we think about language documentation and try to focus on a broader sense instead of language documentation being a slice of language at one particular point in time, actually really try to embrace variation and dynamics and intergenerational variation across language communities. So the next talk from, are you guys going to come up? Or, oh. The next talk from Alex Marley and Sasha Wilmoth relates to this goal of CoEDL. And Alex Marley, well, both Alex and Sasha have been PhD students within CoEDL. Alex Marley is now a postdoc at CSIRO and was ANU PhD student. Sasha is a University of Melbourne PhD student and due to submit her thesis next week. So look out for that one. So over to you two.
So yeah, as Rachel mentioned, some of CoEDL's goals included drawing on innovative approaches and technologies, building the first large corpora of Indigenous Australian and Papuan languages, and initiating new research on how an intergenerational variation can reveal different design solutions evolving in languages to solve similar social communicative problems. So as Rachel mentioned, both Alex and I have been working on this type of approach to language documentation in 2 different Australian languages. So from hundreds of Indigenous languages in Australia, only about a dozen are still being transmitted to children as a first language. So really interested in how might those languages be evolving in the face of changing linguistic ecologies. And to answer those questions takes a lot of time, a lot of data, and a lot of teamwork, and that's something that's been made possible over the course of CoEDL. So Alex did her PhD on Bidingunwa, which is a Gundungulin non-Pamanyuna language in Western Arnhem Land, and I've been working on Bidindara in Central Australia, which is a Western Desert Pamanyuna language.
So the kind of research we were doing, we found that there were some similarities in our field sites and the languages we were working on, but there were also some differences. So some of the similarities included the size of the communities that we were working with, each had around 2,000 to 3,000 speakers. Children are still learning these languages as their first language. There's sort of incidental multilingualism, so it wasn't an inherent feature of the linguistic ecology, it's just sort of something that happened in some of the families there. There was also, we both had about the same amount and time depth of documentation and descriptions of languages. Missionaries arrived in our respective field sites around the 1940s. There's also considerable maintenance of cultural knowledge and many of the cultural practices still ongoing. There's also some differences though. So for example, I'll move to this one. It's too small. For example, in Pitjantjatjara, communities, code mixing and young people's innovations were looked down upon. Whereas in Wilmoth, there's a pretty laissez-faire attitude towards variation and young people's code mixing and the innovations that we're making, that young people are making. Pitjantjatjara, the dominant variety, has largely taken over the other varieties that you get there, whereas in Wilmoth there's sort of been a levelling or a blending of the dialects there. Typologically, there's some differences too. So Wilmoth is very polysynthetic language, whereas Pitjantjatjara is a complex case marking system. So, I'm going to present some of my findings, and I'm going to hand back over to Sasha, and she'll present some of her findings. So, in Western Arnhem-Land, I mostly did my fieldwork in a small outstation called Multigenerational, and a little bit in a couple of other outstations of one of the major communities called Longitudinal. There's a reasonable amount of regional variation there. However, I kind of noticed that particularly in Wilmoth, which is the largest community of Wilmoth speakers, there seems to be evidence of dialectal levelling, people using all the dialects and maybe keeping a couple of key shibboleths, but most of it's sort of flattening happening. And there's quite a lot of awareness of this in the community, particularly there's a lot of awareness and change and variation in the language, but particularly with code mixing with English and Creole and Wilmoth. So in order to do the type of synchronic and diachronic research approaches that we wanted to take, we had to build corpora. So the corpus that I built is from my own fieldwork and also from all these heritage texts that I was able to access from archives. And so in the end I had about 108 speakers, and these speakers ranged in age from about 6 to 80 years, but their birth date was around a century, so I had quite a reasonable time depth to kind of probe. This is about 28 hours worth of data, and the text that I got, this data from the narratives, procedurals, elicitations, all sorts of things we used to create this corpus. So, one of the most clear-cut examples of change that I found in Wilmoth was in the pronominal paradigm. So the intransitive pronominal prefixes in Wilmoth, which I see here in this matrix, has a 12-way person number system. So you'll see that there's, on the y-axis, there's 4 persons, first person inclusive, first person exclusive, second person, third person, and on the x-axis you've got minimal, unit, augmented. So there's 2 types of first person here, you'll note. There's an inclusive, where we talk about we, including you, and first person exclusive, so we excluding you. And you'll also notice that the number system is a little bit different to what many of you are probably familiar with. The number system and pronouns usually, more often being something like singular, dual plural, singular plural. Wilmoth, in the intransitives, has what we call a relative system. This is minimal, unit, augmented system. It's quite uncommon in the world's languages, but mostly only found in Northern Australia. So what I observed in Wilmoth is that speakers of this, in Wilmoth speakers, is that one of these pronouns, specifically dane, which is there in the orange, has more or less become obsolete. And this has ramifications for the shape of the pronoun as a whole. So we can, importantly, I wanted to find out who is, when and where this kind of change is happening. So I was able to have a look at the data by using a corpus at how frequently and who was using this pronoun previously and how it's being used or not used now by younger speakers. So I've got a comparative chart here where you can see each of the pronouns and the meanings of the pronouns. And you'll see here that Generation 3, which is anyone born after 1975, 1976 onwards, they have no instances of this pronoun at all. So it's basically disappeared. And what we see in the next, this part of this chart, I should put an arrow in there, we see that instead, for the context that other older speakers might have been using dane, younger speakers are using a different pronoun. So what this means is that instead of this paradigm shape, which is sort of the canonical, traditional one that you might find in earlier descriptions of the language, the new version of the paradigm is, oh yeah, sorry, thank you, that was me, has actually shifted to a singular dual plural. And this pattern is far more common in the world's languages. So this is quite interesting in terms of understanding how paradigms evolve over time. We've got linguists, we've got lots of theories, and we've got theories about how pronominal systems evolved. And what we've captured here is an example of it happening almost in real time. So it's really great to see this rather than having to rely on historical models. We can see it actually happening. The second finding I'd like to share is, too many buttons to press, is on a variation that I found. And that's a result of contact problems, things happening internally, internal machinations of the language. So I was particularly interested in the variation in how Binning incorporated verbs from English into, and Creole into Gunwok. So I put here the basic verb structure of Wilmoth verbs. You've got a pronominal prefix, some of which we just saw on the slide earlier, and then you've got a verb stem, and then you've got a suffix on the end that adds some extra information about tense or aspect marking. So when Binning encounter an English or Creole verb that they want to incorporate into the language, they have two strategies that they can do this. The first one is an indirect insertion, where they take the verb and they affix on the Gunwok morphology. So we see here I've taken the verb download or downloading in Creole, and they've got the prefix on the front, a pronominal prefix now, and at the end we've got this verbalizing suffix, which tells us that whatever comes before that is a verb. And I'm downloading there. The other strategy is a periphrastic construction. It's a co-verb construction, which is reasonably, this type of construction is reasonably common in Australian languages, although not so much in Gulingua languages. And in this type of construction, we have two elements, or actually separate words. We've got the download at the front, which has all the semantic information of the verb, and then after that we have what we call a light verb, which carries all the grammatical information, such as tense aspect marking, subject, person, the person doing the verb. So you can see the two elements there. So these are the two types of strategies that have been in use. So I was interested in sort of why are there two different ways of doing this and who's doing what. So I had a look at things like whether there was a difference between Creole verbs coming in one way, that English verbs coming in another, and there's no difference there. They're both used, both equally likely to have. So I need some water. Thank you. Excuse me. Much better, thank you. So there's no difference between whether it was an English verb that was brought in or a Creole verb that was brought in. There was no, also there were no other indications that something like a number of syllables, that didn't seem to show any indication of difference. There's no phonological reason for why there might be a preference for one or the other. And I've already mentioned source language. So, what I did find though is that there's a preference for this generation 3, which I mentioned is anyone born after 1975-76. There is kind of an increase over time of a preference for the co-verb construction. I named this slide The Rise of the Co-verb after a chapter from John Mansfield's thesis on the same topic, where he concluded that the rise in co-verb construction of Murrumbidgee due to syntactic and prosodic incongruities between Murrumbidgee and English. I haven't found the same things in Gunwok, but we are seeing the same pattern in the sense that there seems to be a rise in this structure in Gunwok. And this is interesting from a couple of perspectives. It's interesting because there does seem to be more and more code mixing in the Gunwok communities. As more English and Creole verbs are brought into the language, and there seems to be the possibility of a kind of mixed language evolving, particularly in Gunwok. It's also interesting from an evolutionary perspective because we know the way that verbs evolve. We like to, this might be interesting to see how the verb systems might be changing. Here we're getting instances of sort of a dual verb construction system that might become a more prominent feature over time. I'll hand over to
Sasha. So I'll also just present a couple of little findings from my thesis. So I've been working in Thieberger, also known as Annabelle, which is that little green dot on the map just below the NT border in South Australia. And a lot of elders there are very concerned about language change, and they say things like the young people aren't learning proper Pidgin anymore and they're mixing it up with English. And there has been previous work in the 90s based on teenage girls' Pidgin in a different community further north. And because of this, Pidgin is being described in the literature, for example by Felicity Meekins, where she is, as a restructured variety of a traditional language. So a traditional language, but one where there's significant influence on the grammar from English. I don't think that's entirely accurate. So my corpus consists of mostly recordings I've made with women in Thieberger from their late teens up to their 80s. And I also have been able to include a really nice experimental data set, which was with 50 speakers in Thieberger. I think Rachel will talk about that later today. So that's all up 44,000 words of recordings I've made. And I've also been collecting previously published texts into a Flex database, so that's about 30,000 words. So I'll also talk about how verbs are borrowed into Pidgin data. So traditionally, if you can say such a thing, if you want to borrow an English word, there's the suffix miller for the transitive verb, so you could say download a milani. And that's actually originally from Creole in plus an iota causative illa. And that's been around for a while. It's documented since the first description of the language in the 1940s. Annie Langlois, in her study of teenage girls' speech, also found this more innovative suffix ma. So instead of download a milani, you can also get download a money. And likewise, in Pidgin I found both of these suffixes, and there's a very clear trend here where ma is taken over from miller, beginning with speakers born in the 1960s or so. But I've also found different variation in how these verbs are inflected. So just briefly, there are 4 inflection classes in Pidgin verbs. When verbs are borrowed with miller, they're always in the L class, so I won't talk about that. But I found variation when they're borrowed with ma. So you can have this L class pattern, download a money, to say the present tense, downloading, or you can say the same thing with download a money, and that's the end class pattern. So in my data, this is just those speakers who use ma. This end class pattern is quite new, so it's mostly girls in their late teens and 20s who are using this. So why might they be preferring or beginning to use this pattern as well as the L class pattern? And I think that's because traditionally in Pidgin data, if you have a disyllabic verb or a disyllabic suffix, it usually goes in the L class if it's transitive. If you have a monosyllabic verb or suffix, that verb usually goes in the N class if it's transitive. So what these young women are actually doing is they're taking this more innovative suffix and they're making it fit the overall system of verbal inflection of the language. So it's an example of this sort of ongoing change that's actually maintenance. And what I think is cool here, you sort of see generations of innovation. So at some point, people have made up this suffix miller, and then people start to use ma instead, and now young speakers are in the process of readapting ma to their existing system of prosodically conditioned morphology. The other thing I'll talk about is possession, particularly of body parts. So Pidgin has usually been described as having an alienability distinction in possessing body parts versus other types of possessions. So when it's a body part, it has the same case. So in the big bird's mouth, you get the locative on both big bird and mouth. Or if it's the man's foot, you just have man foot with no overt marking of possession. On the other hand, other possessions like guitars, you have a genitive possessor, so nai or guitar, that's the pronoun in the genitive case. And people have said before that this distinction is being lost in Pidgin as a result of contact with English, so the genitive is more like an English possession construction. And that's something that's been found in quite a lot of Australian languages due to contact with English and in languages that are undergoing the process of language shift. But I actually haven't found that in my data, so the dark grey is that body part construction, the light grey is the genitive construction. So there is variation that appears to be stable across all generations. So there must be something else driving this variation, and we can see some patterns when we look at examples. So for example, in this story, She's saying the leaf grew on him / his hair, so this is using that body part construction with the locative on the possessor and the possessor. And that's because here that little boy is the topic of the story, and he's also sort of, you could say the leaf is equally on him as much as it's on his hair. Later in that same story, the same speaker uses the genitive, so she says that tree grew really tall, and his hair grew as well, and he grew as well. And here she uses the genitive to refer to his hair. And here that's because the possessor, he's not really involved in the event of his hair growing. He's growing as well, but that's a different event with its own sentence. Later on, the same speaker, and I should say this is a woman in her 60s, she's talking about the impacts of colonisation on animal communities, including health issues from introduced foods. So she says, our bodies became sick, first using that genitive construction, and then she sort of rephrases it and says, junk food made us / our bodies sick, using that body part construction where they're in the same case. And I think here she's rephrasing because she really wants to emphasise the harms that have been caused and to solicit empathy from the listener. And as it turns out, these factors like effectiveness and topicality and empathy, they're really well-attested factors across many languages that you would use that sort of body part construction, which is an external possession construction, in variation with the genitive for body parts. So here I found that the variation is actually stable in Pidandutta, and it doesn't appear to be due to language contact, even where one of the variants resembles English. And this is also an area where understanding the variation in the language has led me to a better understanding of the semantics of that construction and also the syntax of it. So, in conclusion,
we found that there were, again, some similarities and some differences in our research findings. Both languages are still undergoing still strong maintenance of these languages. We found that it's both system internal, a better way of saying it, variation and change, things that were sort of happening naturally, but there was also some contact-induced change happening in both cases. There's also both languages have an increased amount of borrowing from English and Creole. We also found some changes that we haven't discussed here today because our projects were so big. We found lots and lots of other things that were kind of interesting. Some of the other things that we found were both of our languages are undergoing sound changes. Some differences though, you see in Pitjantjatjara, fundamental syntactic structure has basically remained unchanged. In Wilmoth, there's a huge amount of individual variation, particularly in morphological paradigms. So there's just a huge amount going on there. People almost having their own paradigm systems. Pitjantjatjara English borrowings are morphologically and syntactically integrated, whereas possibly in Longitudinal there is an emergent mixed language which people are already starting to call English. So might be something to watch in the future there with the change in that language. So just to finish up here, we wanted to kind of show, to say that yeah, languages are dynamic, and we've really, that point has really been brought home to us in the type of research that we've been doing. But just some thoughts that we had was that so basically this traditional versus contemporary way of talking about Indigenous language is not necessarily accurate or useful because they are undergoing, they're living things and they're also undergoing change. There's variation everywhere you look. One of the other things we're interested in was what changes are concerned for language maintenance. So these projects that we've done have helped us understand a little bit about which bits of variation and change might be something that we could kind of focus on further. That might tell us which direction language is changing and other things that are sort of, that's just going to happen anyway. The point that I really wanted to make is that living long and prospering will look different in different languages. So this is why it's really important to do, when you're doing documentation, to also include also incorporate variation studies into your research, because languages are dynamic, basically. I'm going to pass on to Sasha if you show up.
So in terms of how to study this, to do this sort of studying variation in an Indigenous language context or in a language documentation context, obviously the most important thing is to have really good relationships with communities, and that has helped us to sort of attune to local linguistic ecologies and speakers attitudes and ideologies that can shape variation. And we've both tried to keep an eye on both the synchronic and diachronic aspects of variation and think about how the sort of micro-variation that we can observe in the present day might link to longer-term changes in the language. And both of us have really benefited from that rich base of prior documentation stretching back 80 odd years. So that's allowed us to build these large corpora, which means we can investigate these sort of variables quantitatively. And even though these languages are really well documented and well described relative to other Australian languages, there's still always more to say about them. And also something that CoEDL's been an amazing opportunity for us is that we can be in conversation with others who are working on the same languages, such as our supervisors, Nick Evans or Rebecca Defina, and others in CoEDL who are doing similar sort of work and interested in similar questions. So Felicity, Carmel, Amanda, John, and others as well. So it's been hugely beneficial for both of us. That's it. Thank you. Excellent, thank you. We've got time for questions. Oh, look. It's dropping out, my goodness. All right, well, we'll wait and see who the microphone can get to first.
That was interesting. My question is for you, Sasha. For the pin data, can we go back to the genitive ones?
Yep.
So the genitive marker you got here, barum and nganam, is not the genitive marker that would be found in all the historical sources that you mentioned.
Yeah.
We'd get barumba and nganamba, as you know. So my question is, do you have examples that show these types of constructions with that complete?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. So I've also been documenting a lot of phonological and phonetic variation in language. So one of those is sort of deletion of final vowels or final syllables. So you do get a lot of variation between palumba and palum. And here, because it's also Manka starts with an M, so it's both bilabial, so that's why she sort of elided that. But there's a lot of variation between the full form, palumba or nanamba and nanamapala, and that's just a phonological change.
And you find that, so you get examples of barumba manka?
Yeah.
That's
right. Thank you. Felicity?
So actually, on that same slide, sorry, Sasha, I was wondering whether you separated out the locative examples from the unmarked sort of absolute positive examples. And the reason I'm asking that is whether there's case stacking in Pitjara, which I understand that there isn't. So in fact, when you're seeing variation, I guess, between the use of genitive versus a sort of unmarked form where you've got locative marking across the clause, you're not going to expect genitive marking anyway. So it's a purely sort of morphological reason why you're not getting genitive marking that explains the variation, and then the sort of topicality issues and that sort of thing are kind of on top of that.
So yeah, I did code for the case, and that wasn't a significant factor at all, but you can actually get the case stacking. So,
so you can get
case
stacking.
So in that second example, she also could have said, if it was locative, she could have said manka param manka. So,
okay, great. Thank you.
Bill, did you go first?
Thanks. That was, is this on? Yeah. Thanks. That was terrific. But at a very broad social level, have either of you got a sense of why there are such different attitudes towards co-mixing and innovation in the communities? It's quite remarkable. I was curious if you thought there were broader reasons for those very different attitudes.
Different communities, different cultures, really diverse cultures, I guess.
I feel like a lot of the conversations I had about these attitudes were with older women who have worked in education in Bible translation, so I think they might have those sort of attitudes influenced from that, but I don't know if there's a similar effect.
No, I mean, sometimes, the closest thing sort of I found was people going, oh yeah, kids, they don't speak it right, but then the speakers themselves sort of mix language, or they'll use forms that they don't think are sort of true. But there's just, people are very, very relaxed about it. So it's just always been like that, perhaps. why there's so much variation in Wilmoth, because people have these very relaxed attitudes towards it.
The subtext to my question is whether there's more Pentecostals in Gunwalk.
Well, in Annabelle, that was a Presbyterian mission. But I think also that people see those innovations in the language as representing a whole lot of other negative changes, so it's really linked to ecological deterioration in the country and health problems and other cultural loss as well. So.
Other questions? Oh, yeah. Judith.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you. Just a question about those borrowings from English and Creole. I'm just wondering whether there's any domain dependency there. Like, are there cases where there's a good Gunwalk alternative and yet an English or Creole word is being used? And a sort of the second part is whether, as in French, where there's a deliberate push to coin new words for, say, technological terms when you use download. Is there anything like that happening?
Yeah, that's, I did look at that too. So there are examples in the corpus where you've got a perfectly good word to help, and then people using both to just incorporating the English word help in. So you do get instances like that. Coining occasionally, but I'd have to look into that a bit more actually, because I didn't come across it very much. Most of that just grab a word that already exists and bring it in rather than having to go to the trouble of building a new one. Yeah.
Interesting, thank you.
My question is for Sasha, but it's sort of related to the two, like what is the difference, following on from your question, these sort of language attitudes and ideology questions. So those older people that you're talking to, did you have interactions with them about like their forebears who commented on their language change? Because of course their language changed, language is dynamic, it's changing, so they think they're in this static position where they're reflecting on young people's change and bagging young people all the time. But it's sort of another question like, what was going on with you? What was changing with you? And what did your elders say to you as they observed this slower, it's the speed of change that we're in?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I might raise that with people next time I go and visit, but I think people are aware that young people say this. I mean, yeah, we say it too sometimes. We should say it this way, but even we say it that way. So there is some awareness that they also have some innovations in their language, but I don't know what their elders would have been saying.
And just the last quick thing is just having those community workshops about this so that it's beyond your intimate one-to-one interactions, but actually as a discussion, because I think that's really important in that language ideology framework. How do we make this a community issue?
Yeah, absolutely.
Nick, do you have a question? Yeah, final one. We'll hand the final word to the director.
I had another question relating to another source of variability in communities, which, especially for the Pindyat, we were generating a lot of fantastic materials through Lizzie and Inga's work and others. That is creativity and mastery of storytelling and other speech styles, which can feed back into the more general adoption of innovative forms that were created in the sort of heat of storytelling or performance. And did you look at those phenomena at all, or do you think it's possible to see things like that happening?
I didn't specifically look at those sorts of things, but it is something that a lot of those concerns relate to, I think. So, everyone, like Milbridge and only sound stories is a really common practice, but people are concerned about losing other types of registers and stuff. And that's, I visited Arielka School recently, I'm going up again in a couple of weeks, and that's something that they're interested in talking about in the curriculum as well, as building in those sorts of registers and having the kids learn and respond to those kinds of
I just want to give one example of the sort of thing, because you were talking about the extraction of preverbs, but some really great speakers of Binigunok and Dalabon, when they're telling a story to dramatise it, they pull out the preverb from the verb and just things like this, which is one place where you would expect it to be loading the dice between those two structures?
Yeah, okay, so it might be worthwhile looking at what, yeah, the sort of the context of when it's happening, if it's a narrative or something, or it's instructions. Yeah.